Hey guys, so in this video we're going to be talking about numbers, right? So there's two main specific data types in this video of numbers. One of them is going to be integers, which think of integers as whole numbers, and the second data type is going to be float. Float is decimals. So we're going to talk about both of these different data types on how they could be used interchangeably as well, and how you cannot use them and as well. So we're kind of gonna, and I'm gonna show you some examples. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first one that I'm gonna show you is gonna be integer. Again, integer is a whole number, guys. A whole number. Think of it that way. If it happens to have a period, a decimal, right, and then with some sort of number placements after that, that is considered a float, which is a decimal. So ultimately, we're going to start off with integers, which is whole numbers. So let's go ahead and do something like in our previous video, we're talking about age, right? So we know age is a whole number. And then the example that we used in the previous video with age was 23. Now we saw in that video that this is a string because we have single quotes around the number. Now if we remove the single quotes, this now becomes an integer. So if I were to go ahead and print it, call my type method and pass in my object, which is age, let's go ahead and run it. We'll see down here that it is a integer, right? Because we removed the single quotes. So now it becomes an integer. This, if we were to add a 0.0 at the end and run this, now again, same value, but now it becomes a float. So keep in mind, Python is dynamic. It's a dynamic language, and what that means is there's a lot of auto determination that it's going to do, right? Based on whatever we're providing, whether it be if we put this in a single quotes, for example, if we would have passed it in this way, Python knows, hey, there's single quotes. This is a string. So if I run it, we will see it's a string. If we remove it, now Python has to determine, is this an integer or a float? So, but I know that it's a float because there's a decimal placement, right, of 1. So that's how they're able to determine, hey, this is a float value. But if we remove it, now it's able to determine, hey, there's no decimal places, there's no single quotes. It's able to determine this is an integer value, again, a whole number. So now let's kind of go to another example. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to call this x equals 5. Again, a whole number, which means this is an integer. Y equals 7. Same thing. This is an integer because it's a whole number. And we're going to call this total. And now we could add these other variables together. We could do x plus y, right? X plus y. And ultimately, if we print this total, and also let's do a type of total. So keep in mind in your print statements, you can have many different, it takes many argument placements. So whatever, how many argument placements you have, in this case, it's here's one value, and then here's another one. It's going to print it out in our print statement. So if I hit print, it tells us 12 is the total, and then the data type is an integer, right? And it makes sense when we look at it, right? This is an integer, so it's 5 plus 7, which is an integer as well. So integer plus integer equals an integer still, which happens to be a 12. But let's say we were to change the 7 to a 0.0, right? We change it to a 0.0. So now we're going to be saying we're adding an integer with a float. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run it. If we run it, see how now the total value is a float? And again, it tells right here it's a float, and we could tell because it shows the 0.0 in the value. So what's happening underneath the hood is Python wants to keep both values consistent. So instead of converting the 7.0 to 7, because again, if it's 7.5, you don't want to, convert this to a 7. like make this to a whole number, because now you're going to be missing the 0.5 value out of it. So normally what Python does is, hey, it's going to take this X, it's really going to convert this to a 0.0. So now both of these are float values. So X is a float, Y is a float. So now it's able to add them together with no issue. And now our value, our total value, is going to be a float value because of the conversion that's being done underneath the hood. So that's just something to keep in mind. Also, as we just saw right now, we could add a whole number, which is an integer, with a decimal number, which is a float, right? We could add those together. There's no issues because Python does a lot of the legwork underneath to allow us to add these numbers together. But let's just say we're trying to add a string, right? Because like I mentioned, anything in single quotes or double quotes is a string, even though visually we know that that's a number. But because it's in the single or double quotes, it's considered a string. So now if I were to run this, we're going to get an error. And it's telling us unsupported operator type for float and string. We cannot add a string and a float together. You got to keep that in mind. You cannot do that. You cannot add those numbers together. They have to be the same kind. Again, you could add an integer with an integer. You can add an integer with a float, but you cannot add an integer with a string, or a float with a string, or a float with a list, or etc. The list goes on, right? Different data types. They need to be integer or float. They could be added together. Now, let's say, for example, that we know this is a string, right? Y is a string, but we know it's a number. I mean, it's a valid number, but it just formatted in a string format. So there are some built-in methods that we could use. Like in this case, we would call this float, and then it would take, see how it kind of gives us some information here. Convert a string or number to a floating point number if possible. Okay, so what this is going to do is saying, hey, we know that this is a string, so now we're going to convert this string to a float value, which means now we should be able to add float plus this float value together. So now let's run it, and boom, 12.5, and it's a float. So if you are dealing with string values, because that's how it's coming in, there are some workarounds where you could convert that value. Like in this case, we're converting it from a string to a float, or we could convert it to an integer, right, which is int, and this should work because oh, you know what, it's not going to work. Never mind, it's not going to work because see how it tells us, it knows there is a decimal place of 7.5, and because of that, it is not going to work. In this case, this has to be converted to a float, and a float only. Now, and let's say we wanted to do x, right? If we run it, x works because it's able to say, hey, this is a 0. It could strip this out and make it a 5. And because it's able to do that, that's why this int is able to convert this float to an int. But in this case, you don't want to strip, like lose any values. So because it's a 0.5, it is not going to allow you to convert it from a float to an int. But again, this comes in very handy when you're trying to convert a string to a float, or like again, decimal value, or a string to an integer, a whole number. So again, guys, hopefully this gives you a little bit better understanding of, again, two different new number data types in Python, which is integer and float. Integer is whole number, float is decimal number, and there's ways to be able to convert string values to a float and string values to an int, and how we could add them together as well. So again, guys, hopefully this helps, give you some insight, and thanks for watching. Peace.